Welcome to Didactic Residency Edition. I am Dr. O'Leary, a fourth-year psychiatry resident in the National Capital Region. Today, I'm continuing a series discussing the prefrontal cortex. It's that blob of neurons and supporting cells just behind your forehead that really has an outsized effect on your personality and your ability to consider things like verbal, numerical, spatial, time-sensitive, social, emotional, and other types of information all at the same time. Today, I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which takes a lot of information from other cortical areas, and instead of just being able to, for example, see that there is a baseball mitt sitting in the middle of the sidewalk, explore multiple scenarios for how it likely got there, and then form the words you need to tell someone else this. I can get really confused when reading about neuroscience because so many different researchers have either different words for the same thing or slightly different definitions of the same words, or they have terms that include some but not all parts of other named things. Parts of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex have been described as belonging to the frontoparietal network, the frontoparietal control network, the cognitive control network, the executive control network, or just executive network for short. I had noticed that there seemed to be different definitions for these, sometimes appearing to be used kind of interchangeably, while other times being referred to as kind of separate things. For example, one might be actually a subset of the other. I asked Google Bard to explain the differences between these terms, and it basically agreed with my assessment, saying that the terms were often used in overlapping, inconsistent ways that, quote, there is no single agreed upon definition for, unquote. This does not stop me, however, from discussing what is connected to the various parts of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, what it then connects to, and then why this is important. I should also point out that from kind of a gross anatomical perspective, what people often refer to as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex can be much larger than what researchers who are focusing just like on our executive network are referring to. Grossly, there are 3 gyri in the brain that comprise the large anatomical versions of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. They are stationed just like anterior to or in front of parts of our motor cortex, our supplementary and premotor cortex, and our frontal eye fields. These gyri, I really love saying that word, gyri, they're aptly named the superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. I love it when things are that easy. But while it's easy to draw ellipses around these regions from top to bottom, these ellipses do not actually do a good job of distinguishing the region's functions. The middle frontal gyrus forms the center of what is often referred to, in a very strict and limited sense, as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But today, I'm going to include the inferior and superior gyri along with the middle gyrus in my discussion. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex contains all 6 of the possible layers of cells in the cortex. I'm not going to go into detail of each of these layers because that would require an entirely different episode. I will say that some of these layers exist because they are composed of connections between different regions of the cortex and the thalamus, and the cortex and striatal regions. The fact that all 6 exist here in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex means that it has maximal connectivity to the rest of the brain. Additionally, the pyramidal neurons in the cortex are modulated heavily by serotonin and dopamine levels. And this helps explain how depression and anxiety can respond to the agents that inhibit the reuptake of serotonin and dopamine. The raphe nuclei in the brainstem produce and ship serotonin to the prefrontal cortex, while the ventral tegmental area produces and delivers dopamine. Cortical neurons also receive glutamate from the mediodorsal thalamus. Glutamate is the main neurotransmitter that is used for neurotransmission between cortical neurons and other regions of the brain, but this transmission is highly modulated by levels of serotonin and dopamine. Today, I'm not focusing on the particulars of the neurotransmitters, but instead on the functions of regions and their networking capabilities. Let's start with a discussion of the inferior frontal gyrus and then work our way up. The inferior frontal gyrus is so named because it's on the inferior part of the lateral surface of the prefrontal cortex. If you were to move up, then you would run into the middle frontal gyrus. If you were to go down and then along that curve under it, you would be in the orbitofrontal cortex. The inferior frontal gyrus has three main anatomical parts. There is the pars orbitalis, because it is the closest to the orbits. The pars triangularis, which is, the middle part and shaped like a triangle, and the pars opercularis, which is in the more posterior part. Aside from sounding like the names of an order you might give dragons in the Game of Thrones or a spell in Harry Potter, the pars opercularis is also called the operculum, which basically means window. It's called this because if you lift it up, you can see the insula under it. It's the window or operculum to the insula. Much of the pars opercularis and pars triangularis comprise what's known as Broca's area, a major hub of our speech, where we kind of interpret and produce speech. Broca's area is on the left side of our brain in about 95% of right-handed people and also in about 70% of left-handed people. Broca's area is extensively connected to a region called Wernicke's area via something called the arcuate fasciculus. Wernicke's area is especially important for understanding speech. Wernicke's area is located on the superior part of the temporal lobe near the temporal parietal junction. The arcuate fasciculus is so named because in order to get to or from Broca's area to the temporal lobe, it needs to arch through the parietal lobe and then back into the temporal lobe. I don't want to mislead you, so I should mention that the arcuate fasciculus contains many more fibers than just the ones connecting like Wernicke's and Broca's area. Broca's area also has connections to the anterior putamen and the ventral anterior nucleus of the thalamus. And this helps executing motor aspects of speech. It was thought initially that Broca's area was only a speech production area. It becomes active when we're preparing to speak and even when we're kind of watching someone else speak. The pars opercularis in particular appears to coordinate a motor plan for speech, while the pars triangularis seems to be involved more in kind of deciding what words to use. There are connections called the frontal aslant tract. It's a more newly discovered tract, also abbreviated FAT or FAT. And the frontal aslant tract links Broca's area with the anterior cingulate and the pre-supplementary motor area that's located in kind of the more posterior part of the superior frontal gyrus. Broca's area also contains many mirror neurons, which likely help us to mimic speech and in that process to learn speech. There is some evidence that Broca's area also helps us to interpret language, especially when sentences are more complex or ambiguous. The pars opercularis in particular may be helping to understand things like subtle changes in meaning, like when we intonate words differently, use a different prosody of speech, like when we say something in a sarcastic way. Well, that was cool. Or, wow, that was cool. I've so far neglected the pars orbitalis on the front part of the inferior frontal gyrus. I could not find a lot of information like strongly supporting a particular distinct function of this area. This region is somewhat transitional and supportive. It appears to contain kind of more broad connectivity to other cortical regions, such as the orbital frontal cortex and even the occipital cortex, than is contained in the triangularis or the opercularis. The orbitalis part of the gyrus may help play a role in inhibition of emotional and motor responses, and by helping the rest of the brain consider aspects of the context of information. In the inferior frontal gyrus in general, there appears to be kind of a posterior to anterior gradient, or you could call it an anterior to posterior gradient in the amount of interconnectivity with cortical motor regions, such as like the supplementary motor cortex and the primary motor cortex. The opercularis is extensively connected with the supplementary motor area and the primary motor regions. The triangularis, a little bit in front of it, is connected more to the supplementary motor cortex, but not so much to the primary motor cortex. The orbitalis kind of lacks these motor cortex connections. However, both the orbitalis and the triangularis, which is in the middle, are connected extensively to the insula, putamen, caudate, and the subthalamic nucleus. But the opercularis is not. It appears that the opercularis is more concerned with like planning out behaviors, and the triangularis and orbitalis especially are more concerned with what to do and whether or not to do or say something. There's also a big difference between the left and the right hemispheres. So the left side seems more concerned with speech. But what is that kind of right side doing? You may be interested in what's hanging out in what would be Broca's area on the right side of the brain, or that non-dominant side of people's brains. It doesn't really make sense that the left hemisphere would have specialized areas and the right would not. It would almost have to, by definition. It appears that what would be Broca's area on the right side also plays at least a minor role in understanding and producing speech, but not a big one. There is evidence that it is more interested in error detection, like trying to figure out why a person's words conflicted with what they're doing. Maybe if they say left but point right, it looks for mismatch and conflict. It also contributes to maintaining attention and to salience detection, which is basically looking for important details. The right side may help pull cues out of language that the left side would miss because, well, it's really more focused on trying to make language. Another function of the right inferior frontal gyrus is to inhibit automatic responses. We know this from tests that have someone respond to a go signal, which is frequent. Go, 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 go. And every once in a while, it's followed by a stop signal. The right inferior frontal gyrus, in concert with the pre-supplementary motor cortex, is more active during this stop-go task. Since there is no Broca's area on the right frontal lobe, neither is there a Wernicke's area on the right superior temporal lobe. So the connections via the right arcuate fasciculus are not specific for language processing. What the right superior temporal area corresponding to Wernicke's area does is not clear, but it might be helpful in things like social cognition or nonverbal memory. It was unclear to me that we knew much about this area while I was reading, possibly because, well, the kinds of tests that we give people to test for brain function are not really specific for that part of the brain. I remember as a kid being taught that most of our brain space is unused, and if we could use it all, we would be super intelligent. But this is a myth. We just don't know how to interrogate all the parts of our brain that we do use, so we think it's not working. Anyway, before I gave a brief description, or maybe a too long description, of the inferior frontal gyrus. The dominant, usually left side, is very concerned with producing speech, and the non-dominant, usually right side, is more concerned with paying attention to clues in the environment that might mean something, and whether or not we should do something. Both of them have important connections to the pre-supplementary motor cortex via the FAT, or frontal aslant tract fibers, to the superior temporal lobe via the arcuate fasciculus, and also to the insula, basal ganglia, and thalamus, among other regions of the brain. That's enough to say for now about the inferior frontal gyrus. Let's move a little bit higher to the middle frontal gyrus. This is not the medial gyrus. Medial refers to the parts of the brain between the hemispheres. The middle frontal gyrus is on the lateral surface of the frontal lobe between the inferior and superior gyruses. Gyri. It may be easy to confuse the terms medial, meaning more toward the center, and middle, meaning between two other things. I want to point out here that when many people broadly refer to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, they're actually referring mainly to this middle gyrus specifically, because many of the functional specializations that people think of when they hear the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex come from this middle gyrus. When people go for transcranial magnetic stimulation therapy, or TMS, the center of this middle frontal gyrus on the left side of the brain is where they're aiming that magnetic energy. That's because there is also some laterality to the middle frontal gyrus. Because the left middle frontal gyrus is in such close proximity to Broca's area, it makes sense that they would talk to each other. And so the left middle gyrus is reported to be more tuned to literacy, and the right more tuned to numeracy. But these are not absolute and exclusive abilities. The right side may be more mathy, and the left more a storyteller, but lesions on the left side might also produce acalculia, the inability to calculate things. So this division is not an absolute thing. The middle gyrus is also very active in our working memory, where we store the things that we need to be thinking about right now. Our working memory is rather fragile and can be disrupted by competing stimuli. And that's why when you really need to focus and think about something, it's best to try to find a quiet place, turn off the notifications on your phone and your computer, and just immerse yourself in that topic. Attention or focus on a topic. It's really a broad term. I mean, we can discuss being able to maintain attention on a single point in space, for example, or something moving through space, or someone reading a story, or a line of thought related to a single subject, or performing long division in your head. Attention may need to be more focused on the external or the internal environment. Working memory is kind of a prerequisite for attention, because if you can't actually hold a substantial amount of information to be considered, then your attention would kind of necessarily just be more enslaved to your immediate surroundings. Squirrel. Let me discuss a minute about how you might be influenced in the moment to put your attention on something that you're sensing. The frontal eye fields are located at the caudal, or kind of the back end of the middle frontal gyrus. They're a major hub of what's been called the dorsal attention network, which focuses on what the brain thinks are salient aspects of its environment. The frontal eye fields work with regions in the superior parietal lobe and the intraparietal sulcus to identify and track things through space. Magicians and pickpockets love the frontal eye fields because they process information quickly and force people to move their eyes together toward a different spot or something that is moving. They can distract you. In neurology, they call these tandem eye movements saccades. Part of the middle frontal gyrus may also be necessary in helping to suppress these faster parts of the brain, like the frontal eye fields. Imagine being in a central downtown area in Delhi, India. In order to focus your eyes, you can't be distracted by everything that's moving around you. To oversimplify, the middle frontal gyrus helps us to hold a large amount of different kinds of relevant information in a ready-to-access form, and helps us to maintain our attention where it needs to be, to keep it there and prevent us from changing our attention to things that it shouldn't be paying attention to. Attention can be controlled in a bottom-up kind of way, where, for example, that sensory information forces your brain to put its attention somewhere else, and also in a top-down kind of way, where the brain might suppress thoughts or sensory information in order to focus on what it thinks is relevant information, such as when someone interrupts you when you're kind of in deep thought, and then you find that you can't really comprehend what they're saying because you're really thinking about what you were thinking about before, or you've been listening to them for a while and then you're fading out, like the way that I'm droning on this podcast, and you have probably lost attention in it and maybe come back to it a few times. But it may be the other way around, where parts of the brain need to ignore a person who is talking so you can focus on your thoughts. It may be that you need to ignore a sensation like pain in order to explore another one, like sexual arousal. The middle frontal gyrus seems to be very involved in things like this. It holds a large part of our working memory, that relevant information, and helps us to switch between tasks or between focuses when competing thoughts and competing stimuli are present. It puts our focus on the most important details. With regard to laterality, the right side might be more concerned with managing the switch between this top-down and bottom-up control, while the left side, because of its proximity to our language centers, may be more concerned kind of with making meaning out of these things and being able to say something about it. To do all of this, the middle frontal gyrus needs to be extensively connected to other kind of distant parts of the cortex. The white matter tracts that connect it include the superior longitudinal fasciculus, which connects the middle frontal gyrus to the inferior parietal lobe, posterior temporal lobe, and lateral occipital cortex. There is also a white matter tract called the inferior fronto-occipital fasciculus, which connects the middle frontal gyrus to the lingual gyrus and the cuneus in the occipital lobes. The lingual gyrus is called that not because of its association with language so much as because it looks a little like a tongue. And it's on the medial part of the occipital lobes. The middle frontal gyrus, then, is extensively connected to areas of the brain that process sounds and language, as well as visual and spatial information. But it doesn't end there. The middle gyrus also has these U-shaped connections with other cortical neighbors. In this way, the brain is really able to keep information like identity, location, time relationships, social importance, symbolic meanings, literal meanings, conflicts with other information, etc., all together at once. Hence, the middle frontal gyrus is necessary for cognitive flexibility, the ability to consider multiple relevant options and even conflicting options, to make decisions, and to plan actions. Let me back up just a little bit. I started with the inferior frontal gyrus and moved up to the middle frontal gyrus. And now I'm going to move a little higher. The superior frontal gyrus sits just above the middle frontal gyrus. It appears to extend many of the functions of the middle frontal gyrus and may be more active when the complexity of information that we need to consider increases. It is superior in location to the other gyri and also gives us, you could say, superior abilities to think through hard problems and find important details because it's expanding our working memory. Also, like the middle frontal gyrus, it divides certain tasks between the left and the right hemispheres. On the left or dominant hemisphere, damage to the superior frontal gyrus might impair verbal fluency, spatial processing, and working memory. On the right side, this same gyrus might help to more reduce motor urgency, to inhibit impulsive acts. It may also help us with our sense of humor, the right side especially, letting us know what is funny or when to laugh. The caudal or posterior section of that superior frontal gyrus is comprised of the supplementary motor area, so it appears to work with this area to help prime or suppress motor activity, such as laughter. The superior frontal gyrus, if you follow it over that top curve and then down again, is connected with the medial prefrontal cortex, that area kind of between our hemispheres. And so it also probably helps process information related to things like our identity and socially appropriate behaviors. Although I have just treated the superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri on the lateral part of the brain as kind of different things, that was really just for convenience sake. So I could kind of move along the surface of the brain and talk about those areas independently. They are not really separate things. They're contiguous and extensively connected with each other and other regions of the brain. To summarize what I've discussed so far, we seem to understand the specializations of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on the left better than the right side. that's because most of us do a lot more language processing on our dominant or left side. The more inferior and caudal, or kind of you could say posterior parts of the lateral prefrontal cortex on the left side are more specialized with speech. The more superior parts are more involved with working memory, attention control, and like task switching. The entire dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is extensively connected with other cortical regions that pass information to it for consideration. And the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is extensively connected to the supplementary and motor regions that help to plan actions, and also to the striatum, which helps to coordinate these actions. It's also sending information back and forth to the thalamus, which aids in more kind of processing that I don't really understand. Interestingly, though, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex does not get direct somatosensory information. Everything it gets has already been processed and assigned some kind of meaning by some other part of the brain before it is accessible to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and then placed within our working memory and within our conscious attention. I should stop here because this episode is getting long. It's over 30 minutes so far, but I just can't. One part of the discussion that's conspicuously missing is the effects of the regions of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on our motivation and our affective or emotional states. How does it determine how we feel, and how does it really make us do what we do? As a psychiatrist, this question is what really tickles my salience network. I mean, to understand this, we need to know a little more about how the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex interacts with the limbic system and the midbrain to determine things like motivation and learning. These kind of questions might help us to understand things like obsessions, things like compulsions, things like addiction, things like depression. Some major clues to this come from studies using repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, or RTMS, of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Remember when I said that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex does not get direct somatosensory information? Instead, it gets already processed information, and then it processes it even more and tries to relate it to each other. Then it helps us to decide whether or not to do things, if we want to do things or not. There is a feedback loop involved in this process where the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex helps us to decide on what we should and shouldn't do, and then sends signals to the anterior cingulate gyrus, the nucleus accumbens, and even the ventral tegmental area, which are involved in like planning and execution of reward-seeking behaviors, and also in our kind of baseline levels of motivation. TMS that is directed at the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is probably working more indirectly by increasing activity in this region, is then communicating with the nucleus accumbens, which is fed dopamine projections from the ventral tegmental area. In depression, it makes a lot of sense that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex would play some role because the classical symptoms include anhedonia, feeling low levels of energy or motivation, and being self-critical or having these ruminative cognitions about how bad things are. Talk therapies might also help, and their mechanism of action might also be this sort of indirect thing when you stimulate or activate the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and then it activates our basic reward system. I'm not saying that depression is always or mostly caused by a decrease in like dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity or disconnection with these other brain regions, but depression can certainly be treated by targeting the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex with direct electromagnetic energy, or by making it practice its ability to process and interpret speech and think about it for a while. It really is an amazing part of our brain. Thank you for sticking with me during this rather dense topic. In the next few episodes, I plan to continue around the edges of the lateral frontal cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, to the medial prefrontal cortex and the orbital frontal cortex, and discuss these in more detail. Until then, I am Dr. O'Leary, and this has been an episode of Sidactic Residency Edition.